This is Chapter 7 in Developmental Psych. I'm Karen Cannon, and I'm doing the lecture for Mr. Shaw. This is Physical and Cognitive Development in Middle and Late Childhood. And so we think about middle and late childhood as elementary years. And that is the next slide. Think about in early childhood, how that was preschool age. Think about this as ages 6 to 10 or 11. Think about kindergarten through maybe 5th grade or so. During this time, children have slower and more consistent growth. Which is a good thing because we don't want them to be growing like they were when they were infants. They grow maybe 2 or 3 inches a year. Girls tend to be about an average of 4'10" at age 11, boys about 4'9". And that tells us that girls are going to be taller typically at this in this age than boys in this age group. One of the things that is important during this time is exercise. If you read the Stories of Lifespan Development on page 190, that gives you a story of a 9-year-old who is overweight and all of the social and physical problems that go with that. So I would encourage you to read that Story of Lifespan Development about Angie and her weight. Exercise is really important at this age. Children who have parents who exercise regularly are more likely to exercise themselves because of that being a role model for them. Screen time is a big issue because screen time, the more screen time kids have, meaning the more time they're looking at a screen of some sort, whether that's the television, the computer, their phone, the less time they are getting physical activity. And that is all linked to childhood obesity. So a lot of screen time is obviously not good for kids. Next slide is overweight children. This is a staggering statistic that 18% of children in this age group, 6 to 11, are classified as obese. And part of that problem is heredity. The other part is environment. Think about this. Parents who are overweight oftentimes have children who are overweight. Part of that is genetics. They are more prone to be that way. And the other part is environment with basically with the model that the parents play, what the parents are doing, the children are doing. If the parents are not particularly active, children are less likely to be active. If the parents tend to eat unhealthy, children tend to follow that example. So parents' examples is really important. Some of the consequences that children face who are overweight: diabetes, and we're talking about type 2 diabetes from weight. Type 1 is different in that type 1 diabetes is just where those kids genetically are going to have that, and it doesn't have anything to do with their weight. Type 2 diabetes is typically what happens to people who are overweight. So we're talking about type 2 diabetes here. Hypertension, meaning their blood pressure is elevated, and also elevated blood cholesterol levels. Those are some physical consequences. and some emotional and social consequences. One of them definitely is lower self-esteem. Okay, moving on to the next slide, titled Disabilities. With moving on, that is discussed in beginning on page 195. We're going to talk about learning disabilities, and learning disabilities are just what they sound like. Difficulty in learning, and that involves understanding or using spoken language or written language. It can also be in listening and thinking. Here's one thing that learning disabilities are not. They're not the result of a visual problem, a hearing problem, a motor problem, or intellectual problem, or economic disadvantage. Let me explain that. A learning disability is not a learning disability if you just can't see the chalkboard or you can't see what you're supposed to be reading. That does not count as a learning disability. Say a child gets referred for testing at the school. The first thing that they're going to do at the school is to make sure that that child can see and hear. So they get a vision test from the nurse and a hearing test from the nurse. And if the problem's there and they just can't see the chalkboard or they just can't see their book, then it's not a learning disability. So a learning disability can't be the result of like a visual or hearing problem. It's also not categorized as just an intellectual disability. If someone has a very low IQ, that doesn't count as a learning disability. It's a learning disability is something like dyslexia, where the child has a problem with reading. Dysgraphia is where they have a problem with spelling and writing. Dyscalculia is where they have a problem with math, with calcula meaning like calculate, okay? With the differences between boys and girls, 3 times as many boys as girls are diagnosed with learning disabilities. And think about that. With girls, oftentimes this age group, if they're having trouble learning, they're not acting like it, they're not acting out, and so they may not get noticed as much. Boys tend to be more likely to be referred because of their behavior. If they're not able to read, if they're not able to do their math, they are more likely to act out at this age. So they get referred more often. So learning disabilities are basically difficulties that involve understanding spoken language or written language. Moving on to ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In order to be diagnosed with ADHD, a child would have to have one or more of these characteristics that I'm going to tell you about. One of them is inattention. They can't pay attention. Another one is hyperactivity. Another one is impulsivity, meaning they don't think before they act. So they can have one or more of those characteristics. Maybe they have a hard time paying attention and they have a hard time sitting still. So that would be inattention and hyperactivity. Okay, so they'd have 2 of them. So some kids have both the attention and the hyperactivity. Some kids just have one. They just have trouble paying attention, but they don't have trouble sitting still or being still. Autism spectrum disorder. Let me move back to ADHD a second. 4 to 9 times more often diagnosed in boys than girls. So boys, let me rephrase that. Boys are much more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. And again, that is similar to the reason for the learning disabilities. Boys are more likely to be acting out. If a boy's not paying attention, he is more likely to be bothering someone else, where a girl is less likely to be bothering somebody else. So sometimes girls get overlooked and boys don't. So one of the questions that is flying around in society now is whether or not ADHD is overdiagnosed. It wasn't something that got diagnosed many years ago very often at all, and now it seems like lots and lots of kids are diagnosed with ADHD. So just something to think about. Kids with ADHD have a higher risk for some things. They're at higher risk for dropping out of school. They're at higher risk for teenage pregnancies, higher risk for substance abuse, and also higher risk for antisocial behavior. And a lot of that, think about that being linked in with the impulse control. If they have a hard time controlling their impulses, they may have a hard time being able to say no to things that they should be able to say no to. ADHD can be genetic. It can also be because of exposure to substances in the prenatal environment, like alcohol exposure. It also affects executive function. I'm not sure if y'all have talked a lot about that or not, but executive function is just kind of that being able to manage your thoughts, being able to engage in goal-directed behavior, that sort of thing. ADHD is sometimes treated with medication, with stimulants. They do help kids, but they don't get kids to the same level as those who don't have ADHD. So even if a child is on medication for ADHD, their attention may not get to the level of a child who does not have ADHD. And the most effective intervention for ADHD is the medication coupled with behavior management. So that means that the parents are monitoring the child's behavior, the teachers are monitoring the child's behavior, maybe they're on a behavior plan, and that coupled with medication is the most effective. One of the other disabilities that in this elementary age group that we see is autism spectrum disorder. Your book mentions Asperger's syndrome. It is not a classification any longer in the new DSM-5 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it is still in the ICD-10. So sometimes you'll hear Asperger's, sometimes you'll hear ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. And basically what Asperger's is somebody who's very high functioning, and they have fewer symptoms than someone who is further on the spectrum. Kids with autism spectrum disorder have problems in social interactions. They don't read nonverbal cues very well. They oftentimes have repetitive behaviors, and their responses to sensory experiences are different. Say, for example, loud noises. Somebody without autism, that's not on the autism spectrum, a loud noise might bother them, but it won't be that big of a deal. Somebody that's on the spectrum, that really will bother them a lot, might cause them a lot of anxiety, might cause them to act out, other things, any kind of sensory experience. Maybe they, certain tags, that sort of thing. Maybe they can't deal with tags in their clothes. Maybe they don't like certain textures of food. And think about this too. On the autism spectrum, most of us have some of that stuff going on. Nobody likes a tag sticking at them. Some people don't like certain textures of food, but on the autism spectrum, those are just more pronounced. They're a bigger deal. We're seeing more and more cases of autism in society now. I'm going to switch sides here. It's increasing, but we're not for sure if it's because more kids actually have autism or if it just wasn't diagnosed earlier. 1 in 150 kids was diagnosed with autism back in 2002. Now, in 2008, just 6 years later, 1 in 88 kids was diagnosed with autism. So there's a big jump. It's 5 times more prevalent in boys than girls. So boys are 5 times more likely to have it than girls. Some of the causes, there you can see if you look on fMRI, functional MRI, you can actually see some of the abnormalities in the brain structure in the MRI. So it's something that you can see. There might be a lack of connection between the brain regions. That's one of the thoughts about it. Genetics do play a role in it. So these kids are not just, they have some predisposition for it. I have on this slide, it's not caused by blank, and fill in the blank with the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. There was a few years ago a scare that this vaccine caused children to have autism, because what they were seeing was kids were getting their MMR vaccine and then they were showing up with autism right around that same time. And there was some research that was done back in that time that said, yes, that's why that is. And it has turned out to be completely fraudulent research. A lot of celebrities kind of got on the bandwagon of don't vaccinate your kids because it causes autism. And the study that was done that showed that was found to be bogus, fraudulent. And the doctor that did that actually lost his license. You can look up on Google. His name is Wakefield, and it was in the British, he was British, and it was published in the Lancet, maybe 10, 12 years ago, but his name was Andrew Wakefield, and it was found that he was completely fraudulent in doing that research. It was unethical research, and it was done wrong, and he manipulated the results. So it is not caused by vaccines. Okay, going on to the next slide, education. And if you're following along in your book, looking for a page for you. That would be on page 199. There are some terms there, PL 94-142, that is Public Law 94-142, that says that everyone is guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. Okay, so everybody gets to go to school. And Public Law 94-142 was changed, then they changed the name of it basically to IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And just think about this as being a free and appropriate public education for everybody, regardless of whether you have a disability or not. So this law guarantees that if you have Down syndrome, you get a free, appropriate public education. If you have a learning disability, you get a free, appropriate public education. If you have ADHD, autism, any of those things, you are still guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. And with that, the next term is IEP, an Individualized Education Plan. And that is a plan for students with disabilities that the school comes up with, the special ed teachers come up with, the parents, the regular ed teachers, and they are a team, and they work together to make sure that the child is in the best environment and that they do get that individualized attention that they need. LRE is another term that floats around in education a lot. LRE stands for Least Restrictive Environment. And I'll repeat that, Least Restrictive Environment. And this is all explained on page 199 in your book. The idea is that the child with a disability gets to be in as similar an environment as possible to kids without disabilities. So the real translation for that is, as much as possible, the kids with the disabilities are going to be in regular classrooms as much as they can possibly handle. Okay, and moving on to the next slide. So that was all education. Now we're going to talk about cognitive changes and Jean Piaget, which you guys I know have talked about. He's our cognitive developmental theorist. And kids at this age are in the concrete operational stage. Think back when they were pre-operational, and you did that experiment with the two glasses, the tall glass and the short squatty glass. And if you poured the same amount of water in the tall glass as you did in the squatty glass, kids that were pre-operational in their thinking would always say that there was more water in the tall glass just because it looked longer. Even if you could prove to them that this is the exact same amount, they would say that because it's taller, it has more in it. Well, at this age, age 6, 7 or so, they realize that, oh, just because it's in a taller glass doesn't mean that it's more. So this age, concrete means they can reason logically as long as there's a concrete example there. So for example, with math, they may not be able to truly understand multiplication, but they certainly can if you use math manipulatives. And some of you probably remember that, you know, counting things out in your sets. They are also able to do something called seriation. Your book shows a picture of how that works, I believe. Oh, no. Sorry, it does not. I have a picture on my notes here. Seriation basically is being able to put things in order by length, and they can go from smaller to larger. And the next term, transivity, means that in that list of, or in that row, let's say you have a short line, a little bit longer, a little bit longer, and a little bit longer, all the way up. They can move those around, and they know that that A is longer than B, then then A must still be longer than C. And I probably didn't explain that very well because I can't show you, I'm not on video, so that is explained on page 200 down at the bottom. It gives you a good explanation of that. Okay, some more cognitive changes that kids go through is in information processing. This is our other theory. We always talk about Jean Piaget, and then we talk about the information processing theory, which is a little different. During this time, kids are able to improve their ability to control their attention. They're able to pay attention better just because they're older. And that is what the information processing approach is all about. As kids get older, they're more able to do things because their brains are like little computers. They can hold more. Long-term memory begins to increase in middle and late childhood. And so they're able to use some strategies to help improve their memory. And there are strategies listed there that help kids with memory that can help us too. The first one of those is elaboration. So when you're trying to learn something, you can elaborate on that and use examples that relate to your own life. So elaboration might be if you're trying to memorize, let's say the chemical, I don't know, the chemical symbol for something. You might be able to say, okay, I know iron is Fe because I remember going and having to buy some iron at the drugstore for my mom, and it said Fe on there. So just elaborating, pulling things out. Mental imagery is like making a picture in your mind. If you can draw a picture in your mind of something, then you're more likely to be able to remember it. Repeating just over and over is helpful, but with that, not just memorizing, but understanding, giving things meaning, linking information to other things. The last term is metacognition. At this age, kids are able to start thinking about their thinking. And that's what metacognition means, thinking about thinking. They're able to make mnemonic devices. So maybe they, if they're trying to memorize, the staff on a music staff, every good boy does fine. That's a mnemonic device. Or for the lines, or FACE for the spaces on the treble clef. Okay, so those are mnemonic devices. A lot of cognitive changes go on during this time. Thinking, there's two types of thinking that kids are able to engage in at this point. Critical thinking, and critical thinking is just being reflective about things, evaluating the evidence that you have, being able to analyze. So Lots of students just stay on the surface with things, but critical thinking is when you go deeper and when you really look at the evidence. Creative thinking is a little different. It means thinking in a new way, coming up with unique solutions to things that other people haven't thought of before. And a lot of times intelligence and creativity are not exactly the same thing. Somebody who is not just brilliant might be able to think very creatively. So it's a different form of intelligence. Down at the bottom, it says blank is now encouraging more creative thinking. Fill in the blank with China. China is encouraging their students to be much more creative in their thinking. And they've found that in the US, kids' ability to think creatively is declining. And that is likely caused by all the video games that kids watch, all the time they spend on screens, computer screens, phone screens, that sort of thing. And that schools are not emphasizing it as much as, say, schools in China are. The next slide is cognitive changes. I mentioned executive functioning earlier, and in your book on page 205, there is executive functioning is pretty well described. I'm not sure how much y'all have talked about that or not. Executive functioning consists of things like self-control, working memory, and being able to be flexible. These are some changes that happen during middle and late childhood. Kids are more able to concentrate because they have more self-control. With that self-control, they're able to control their impulses, maybe resist the temptation to do something that they would later regret. Working memory, which is the second part of executive function. Kids at this age have to have an effective working memory to be able to do schoolwork. And then flexibility is the third part of executive function. Flexibility just means, in this context, thinking about different strategies and having a different perspective on something, thinking about it differently. So that where it says 3 important components for children's cognitive development and school success. 1 is self-control. 2 is working memory. And 3 is flexibility. Okay, and the next slide is about intelligence. And the definition of intelligence is the ability to solve problems and to adapt and learn from experiences. And the term IQ stands for intelligence quotient. And on page 206, at the bottom, you're going to see a normal curve, and they used Stanford Binet IQ scores. So if you look at page 206, you're going to see right in the middle of that curve a 100. And 100 is an average IQ for anybody at any. And you see how most people are clustered around that. Like 68% of people fall somewhere between the IQ of 85 and 115. And then as you go out on either side, about 26%, or about 13% of people fall between about 115 and 130 for IQ. I think I said 15 and it's 13.5. So about 13% of people fall between 70 and 85 on the low end of the IQ. And then as you go out, fewer and fewer people fall lower and fall higher. So I'm not sure if I made that very clear, but again, 100 is average for anybody. The average range is about 85 to 115. And as you go to the right on that graph, the higher IQs, as you get to the very end, like 145, like hardly anybody is up there, like maybe 0.1% of the population. And down at the bottom, again, like 0.1% of the population is at the very bottom end. Continuing on with intelligence, Sternberg's triarchtic theory says that there are different types of intelligence, and one of them is analytical intelligence. These kids are able to analyze and judge and evaluate and compare things. They say this theory says that there's also creative intelligence. These kids can create and design and invent things. And then there's a third kind, practical intelligence, where they can use and apply ideas and put those ideas in practice. The thing about these three types of intelligence, kids with different types of intelligence, different patterns, especially creative intelligence, they may not look that intelligent in school. Like somebody who is incredibly high on the creative intelligence scale may not really look like a super intelligent kid in school, because there are different kinds of intelligence, and school doesn't always pick up on all of those. Some of these kids don't always quite fit the straight A mold. They might be out of the box somewhere. On page 208, Gardner's 8 frames of mind are listed. And the main thing about this is with Gardner's 8 frames of mind, this basically says that there are 8 types of intelligence, okay? So not everybody looks the same. You can see on page 208, there's verbal intelligence, there's mathematical intelligence, there's musical intelligence, all the way down the line. So the thing that's changed when you look at these types of intelligence and frames of mind is that some schools are changing their ideas about how they assess kids. Kids who are super creative may not do as well on just a pencil and paper test. So some schools are using more of a portfolio. They're grading kids differently. They're seeing what they've done and they're assessing them differently. The next slide is extremes of intelligence. And I mentioned that a little bit with the bell-shaped curve back a couple pages. Intellectual disability is a low IQ, maybe around in the 70s or so. It is mentioned, I have 70, actually probably don't even worry too much about the F70, F71, F72. That's something that I told my class. Those are the, in the DSM-5, those are the codes that go with intellectual developmental disorder. So don't worry too much about those. Those aren't in your book. Your book also, one thing I want to point out to you, your book also used a term earlier on. They used the term mental retardation. That is not a term that's used anymore in the DSM-5 or in the ICD-10. It's been replaced with intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder, IDD for intellectual developmental disorder, or just intellectual disability. The other end of the spectrum for intelligence is giftedness. So it's typically an IQ of 130 or above, or it could be just superior talent, or it could be a combination of both of those, like an IQ of 130 or above and superior talent as well. And one thing I want to bring out about giftedness is that there's some characteristics of these kids who are gifted. Precociousness is one. These kids tend to master their talent very early and without much effort. They just are good at things and they're passionate about those things. Sometimes kids who are gifted march to a little different beat of a different drummer. Sometimes they are passionate and self-motivated about things that others would maybe not be. Your book mentions Bill Gates and even has a picture of him there, talking about when he was a kid, he wasn't particularly fond of school, and he hacked into a computer security system when he was 13. And then obviously Bill Gates ended up being the creator of Microsoft. So sometimes gifted kids don't always fit the mold of being your straight A student that that looks like what you would think. So that is a quick overview of Chapter 7 and these kids that are elementary school age, think, you know, age 6 or so, kindergarten-ish to about 5th grade or so. And that is the physical and cognitive development of this age group. And next will be the social and emotional development of these kids in middle and late childhood.